State of CSS 2020 has arrived and the survey's gone round. It's probably closed by the time this video goes out. One of the interesting questions on there, which is always hard to answer, is about what feature do you think CSS is most lacking, or what feature would you most like to see? And there are sort of ones which are becoming almost cliches, or things that people always ask for, which are actually starting to gain some traction in fixes and future, which is actually making it harder to spot things you want to see happen. So in this video I just wanted to just run through a few of those commonly held things that people want to see developed in CSS, plus a few of my own things. The first one you always see is container queries. People endlessly go on about container queries and how we're missing container queries. That is the idea that obviously we have media queries, the ability that an element will change its CSS based on the width of the browser, the whole page, whereas we work now in more of a component level. So the idea of this menu sort of operating differently on a screen width makes sense, whereas having 6 items on a page, they should really know what to do themselves when they get squished to a certain point and have control over themselves, rather than having to worry about what the browser's doing or the browser width is. The idea is the container wants to have its own settings about what it should do at different widths on itself, rather than thinking about outside factors. There's a few things I've seen where people have managed to make quite complicated calc-based functions, which are using custom properties and the clamp property, which has a min-max setting, and it was to calculate like minimum maximums, and that way you can sort of start to set properties on a container on a component level to start styling things. But it looks really complicated and might end up being more work than it's worth. But there are movements in that area, and it seems to be heading that way in some browsers, that people are toying with something along the lines of a container queries. So that one, which has long been just a thing people have asked for, almost assuming it would never happen, is starting to gain a little bit of traction now, which is good. One thing people often mention is about the ability to add page transitions without frameworks. Obviously, if you're using a React router or equivalent, then you can sometimes set CSS tween transition properties, and you can make nice little slides like fades and things between properties. And some people say that should be somehow part of CSS, that you can latch on to any transition, any page change event, and you be able to just fade it or make it happen. I guess you don't really need a framework. You just need to be able to make sure your app is sort of a single page application, so you can at least latch on to the browser change event, and you can trigger some sort of transition while you load the next bit of content up. But I understand that it would be better if it was sort of a native property that you could just easily add a transition setting or add your own animation and just hook it onto page change. But it's not impossible at the moment, and you could argue we've actually got more flexibility working within a single page app to control completely how your components load and unmount and how they transition between one another. One thing that's always been an issue is the actual styling of HTML elements. It's very difficult still in 2020 to add CSS for a drop-down, or for a range slider, or for just certain aspects of any inputs, any checkboxes, and things like that. Generally, the workarounds people have is that you basically hide the default HTML one, and you make your own UI, and you kind of find ways of translating that back to the hidden real HTML element, and you just kind of basically pretend it's not there. People have sort of just moved away from the HTML standard because if they just find it too difficult to rely on. This is not really a CSS spec. There's not more CSS can really do. It's more about browsers and HTML itself being able to expose those elements so that people can latch onto specific styling within those properties, which I kind of feel fairly confident will happen in time, that people clearly want that and need that ability to style things. HTML seems a lot slower in rolling out features and properties than CSS and JavaScript has been in recent years, but to make the web continue to be accessible and performant, that's going to have to be part of it, that we start upgrading HTML. And maybe even web components could come in here to be something that leverages those values. One that quite often comes up, which would definitely be useful, is the kind of notion of a parent selector. Obviously CSS is kind of top down. You can do nesting, you can target what a child element does when you hover, or what a child element does when a certain class is applied. But on no element could you ever say, I should have a different setting, I should have a different color or a different font. if the parent has this class or if the parent is being hovered. You can't really access the parent when you're inside a particular element styles, which is kind of just part of the original cascade rules about how you would be able to assess from top to bottom what a page would look like. You wouldn't want to then be able to change the containers after they've already been kind of defined. There are pseudo selectors that are not really ready. They're kind of the CSS4 or module 4 CSS selectors for within and has, which means it's not a parent selector, but the idea is you can start to make specifications about if something is within the parent and whether and if the element has certain qualities or everything. So you can start to filter about those parent-child relationships a little better. About you're still operating on the parent, but you can start to specify about if something's happening on the child, and that way maybe it's some way towards that, which is not a solution, but it's promising. The big one I ended up just settling on is just CSS defaults in itself. I've seen an emergence of these sort of really low-level CSS frameworks which don't use any classes or any attributes. They just kind of give you default styles for a body tag, for a div tag, for a paragraph tag, and they give them some nice styles, so you can just attach a basic bit of HTML without any need for learning any actual conventions or docs or anything. Just write standard compliant HTML and you'll just get some nice sensible styles. The reason that's valuable is just because of you can always tell a page that hasn't loaded its CSS. It looks hideously ugly. I don't really know why that needs to be the case. Why is it that the default font is not sans serif? It's that ugly Times you always see. Why is it that the spacing and the colors and everything all just looks so ugly? Maybe that's a good intentional thing. You know straight away something's gone wrong. But it would be nice if just the standard page load, which is more of a browser thing, but if just a non-styled HTML just looked a bit nicer. Anyway, that's quite a nice little debate topic. I'd love to hear if anyone has any things they'd really love to see in CSS, or if you filled out the survey, what you put for that. I guess we'll see what the top ones are when the results come out later this year. But yeah, if you want to leave a comment and subscribe to the channel for some other stuff along those lines. Thanks a lot.